Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me start this event with a small quotation from a book I recently had a chance to read. On his last visit to Slovakia, crowds cheered to him as he passed through the villages celebrating harvest. In Slovak, the celebration of Dožinky. As he traveled down along the Danube River with his wife Zita, his firstborn son Otto, and his first daughter Adelaide. These words are the words of a recent biographer of Karl von Habsburg-Lothringen, the last emperor and king of Austro-Hungary. These words describe Karl's last visit in what was then still Upper Hungary in the summer of 1918. On this trip, Emperor Karl visited Bratislava too, a few streets away from here, in the direction. A public exhibition now shows the pictures of the warm welcome the emperor received from the local rabbi at the synagogue, which used to stand just next to St. Martin's Cathedral. Emperor Karl's uncle and his predecessor as the head of the ancient Austro-Hungarian Empire, Emperor Franz Joseph, actually visited this very building, the Balfi Palace, on the 1st of June 1909, about 113 years ago, when he came to open an orphanage here. All of these facts, which are physically visible to us, are facts of Slovak history and of the history of Bratislava. Yet very little is known about Emperor Karl among contemporary Slovak population. Since 2004, Emperor Karl is venerated as a blessed in the Catholic Church. Yet he is not very well known even among Slovak Catholics. Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure that tonight we at Hanus Days can talk about this history together with a great-grandson of Emperor Karl. It is my great pleasure to welcome among us His Royal and Imperial Highness Archduke Imre von Habsburg-Lothringen. After studies at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland and the College of Europe in Warsaw, Imre began his professional career in finance, working for Ernst & Young in Luxembourg, before assuming his current roles as the director and CEO of Multiplus Finance and Alite Investing, which are companies offering ethical investment services in Switzerland. With his wife Kathleen, Imre is the father of 4 little girls and lives in Geneva, Switzerland. Besides all that, Imre is also the president of the European Fraternity. European Fraternity is a network for young Christian professionals all across Europe, and maybe it's one of the topics about which we will get to talk a bit more in the discussion after Imre's talk today. For now, I will just also use this opportunity to welcome a number of members of the European Fraternity who are here with us today, attending a regional event of this group here in Bratislava. So a warm welcome to all of you here in Bratislava as well at Hanus Days. Before I hand over the microphone to Imre, just 2 practical points. His talk about his great-grandfather will take about 30 to 45 minutes, we'll see. And then there will be opportunity to ask questions, both directly with a microphone or through Slido, which is an online app, which should be seen on the slides after the presentation. I think maybe I can have some information in the air about how can people send questions to Slido already. Do we have information on that? Right, Ano? Yeah, go to slido.com or slide.do or slido.com and write the hashtag BHD22, BHD22. There you can already give your questions. These questions will be voted on, and we'll try to go as many of them as possible in the discussion afterwards. You can write in Slovak and you can write in English. We'll translate the questions that are asked in Slovak. Well, now back to our presenter today, to our speaker. Archduke Imre travels Europe and frequently talks about the life and legacy of his great-grandfather, Blessed Emperor Karl. This is why he is with us tonight as well. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure and joy to hand the stage over to him. Imre, welcome to Bratislava Hanus Days. The stage is yours.
Good evening, everyone. I hope, perfect. So we had a little bit of delay because I was convinced this afternoon to prepare a little PowerPoint presentation, because it's a little bit better to have some pictures rather than just a talk, so you can learn a little bit more about my great-grandfather, Blessed Emperor Karl. And also I hope that English is fine for you. I will try to speak slowly, and but I see that you all have translations, so that's perfect. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Hanus Day for several reasons, but also because of the topic of today, to connect faith and reason in a time where so many people are longing for a meaning in their life, existential questions. And too often, the answers that come to all of us are purely rational. We need both. We need rationality and we need faith. So well done for this wonderful organization that you built up. Also, you talk about the importance of seeking the truth, the good and the beauty. And this is also so important in a time where the world offers another illusion, which is free will in the sense of libre arbitre, leading to deciding about our own identity instead of receiving it by the Creator. Individualist well-being, comfort, pleasure, and things must be done quickly and cheaply. A striking example is to see some of the buildings around Bratislava that were built cheaply and quickly by the communists, and then to see this wonderful city center that tells about your beautiful and long history. And last but not least, it's also a pleasure for me to be here because of the long relationship that my family had and continues to have with your country. As you know, my family, the Habsburg, had the honor to play a major role here for several centuries. And I have to say thank you to Wikipedia, because I checked the number of coronation here in Bratislava. And there were 19 Habsburg kings that were crowned here in this city during the occupation of the Ottomans in Buda. But your history was also a difficult one. You also experienced sufferings. And in the eyes of my family, I always heard, since I was a little boy, about the courage and the tenacity of the Slovak people. Especially my great-grandmother, Empress Zita, who lived a very long time, 96 years old. She said that the Slovaks, despite always being part of another ensemble, another entity, always remained who they are. And this is very important. Tonight I was asked to talk about my great-grandfather, Emperor Blessed Karl, his life and his legacy for today. And it seems very fitting because I saw that the topic of this year is the fragility of identity. And this is, of course, a very timely topic for Europe, who is experiencing a deep identity crisis that I would like to address in a few minutes. But to go back to my great-grandfather, I think it's important to put a little bit the context, also the historical context in place. He was the last emperor and king of the Habsburg Empire that played a role in about 17 current European countries over 6 centuries, from the 13th century with the election of Rudolf I as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, up to the end of the First World War in 1918. Karl only ruled 2 years, from November 1916 to November 1918, in the middle of the First World War, a war he never wanted. These were, of course, very difficult times, taking painful war decisions, secret negotiations treaties to achieve peace that were destined to fail, and finally the negotiations at the end of the war with the National Council in Vienna that wanted him to abdicate and leave the country. He did not accept to abdicate, but he accepted to retire from the executive exercise of power. At the time, he was only 31 years old. I'm 34, just to give you the... in 1913, just before the war, the situation was as follows. You had Cisleithania, represented by the northern and western territories, and Transleithania, represented by the Hungarian crown, especially in the southern part. It was 52 million people, so the second most populous territory after France. It was the second biggest territory after Russia. It was 15 current European countries or part of them, 11 nationalities, 17 common languages, including Slovaks, and all religions were represented. So you can imagine that it was not easy to keep all these people united for so long. But it worked, and it lasted for about 6 centuries. I think it worked for mainly 2 reasons. The first one is that everybody could identify with the emperor and the king. And as an example, he was Karl I in Austria, he was Karl IV in Hungary, Karl III in Bohemia, and so on. The duty of the family was to make sure that the bigger would not eat up the smaller one or the weaker one. This was very important throughout history. The second reason is the decentralization of power and culture. It was recognized that in order to remain all united, a principle had to be applied. It's a principle of subsidiarity. That meant that the upper level, the state level, Vienna, had to perform only those tasks which could not be performed at the more local level. And this can be applied to politics with the instauration of local parliaments, and to culture with the encouragement to practice local traditions, freedom to speak local languages, which wasn't always the case in surroundings territories, the freedom of religion, etc. At his birth, Karl was a great-grandnephew of the emperor and only the 7th archduke in line to the throne. So nobody expected him to become one day emperor, and he thought if he would become one day emperor, it would be when he would be maybe 50 or 60 years old. Nobody believed it, but a nun in Hungary called Mother Vincentia, who had the stigmata and who was living in a monastery in Sopron, and she said, and I quote, "The young Archduke Karl should be wrapped in prayer, because one day he will become emperor and king. He will experience great suffering and be the target of many evil attacks." Blessed Karl was educated the way members of our families were educated. That means, among other things, that they were required to master multiple languages and get familiar with the cultural, geopolitical, historical reality of many different regions of the empire. He also entered into the military very young, where he was given more and more responsibilities. In 1911, Karl became engaged to Zita, Princess of Bourbon-Parma, that you can see here on the picture. They married in 1911, and 3 years later, they experienced a terrible event that is well known in history books. In 1914, Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand was assassinated with his wife in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, provoking a series of war declarations from all parts of European power. This quickly led to what is now known as one of the most terrific, cruel, and bloody war, the First World War. And this event placed young Karl and Zita next in line. And 2 years later, in 1916, the old Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled for 68 years, died. Karl became then, at the age of 29, the emperor and king of a vast empire engaged in a losing war. But as the new monarch, he felt that his first mission was to achieve peace among the nations. In fact, he was the only major ruler who accepted the peace proposal of Pope Benedict XV. All the others, the French, the English, the Germans, wanted to continue the war until the enemy would be totally defeated. As he was the only leader who accepted, this peace proposal could never be implemented. But he was later known as the Emperor of Peace, which is a beautiful title. At the end of the war, US President Wilson's 14 points were implemented. In essence, it meant the empire was to be dissolved, and so were all the bonds connecting and protecting the various peoples and nationalities of the empire. After the dissolution of the empire, Wilson's plan left those countries powerless to defend themselves from the spread of fascism and communism in the 20th century. The chaos and power vacuum would cost millions of lives over the next 70 years, and Slovakia knows about all the suffering that it endured during this time. At the end of the war, Karl was only 31 years old. He was pressured to abdicate, which he never did, and only retired from exercising executive power, and finally was pushed to leave the country with his family. He also never abdicated the Hungarian throne. In 2 dramatic attempts, he tried to return to Hungary, as he felt this was his duty until his death. But the second time, accompanied by his wife, Zita, they were arrested after the treason from a man called Admiral Horthy, whom Karl once gave all his trust. This man also attended his wedding a couple of years before. And on this picture, you can see that Karl and Zita decided to attend Mass before going to Budapest. So they stopped the train and were kneeling at the consecration. This was just a couple of minutes or maybe a couple of hours before some Hungarian soldiers came and started firing on the train because they were told that Czechs were coming. So you can imagine already the whole turmoil at the time. They did not know that it was Karl himself who was coming, and he decided to stop the train and go back because he did not want anybody to die because of him. But at the end he was exiled and sent by boat to the far-away island of Madeira in Portugal. While still on the boat, Karl admired a church at the very top of the island. This very same church was to become his last home when he died 5 months later on April 1st, 1922. Some weeks ago, I had the chance with my family to go to Madeira and to celebrate, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of his death. It was very moving to see so many people of the family, but also pilgrims of all the world, and especially from Central Europe. He died from a pneumonia at the age of 34 in extreme poverty and great suffering, and his body is still there, far away from the family and the peoples he loved. So, in the eyes of the world, this can be seen as a life of failure, but the church very often sees things differently. Karl was beatified in 2004 by Saint John Paul II. All the members of my family were present at this time on St. Peter's Square. In 2008, a process of beatification also started for my great-grandmother, and she has now this beautiful title, Servant of God. It is the stage before beatification. So maybe one day we will be able to have a saintly couple. But let us look a little bit why Blessed Karl and Servant of God Zita were chosen by the Church to serve as example for many of us Christians, and beyond. I think we could look at his life from two dimensions, which is his family dimension as a husband, as a father, but also from his professional life as a head of state, head of the armies, a man of responsibilities. But this would be empty of significance if we wouldn't talk also about a third dimension, which is his spiritual life as a man of faith. Karl and Zita, to talk about the first dimension, Karl and Zita became engaged and then married in 1911. And just before their wedding, they placed their marriage under the protection of the Virgin Mary. They even engraved in their ring a phrase, the start of a prayer that starts with sub tuum. And so my wife and I did the same as well. They were profoundly religious, and of course they educated their children according to the Catholic faith, praying with their children daily. They also tried to set an example of a joyful couple, even in very hard moments. Some of the older aunts and uncles recalled, for instance, quite well the situation in Madeira. They said they didn't know that they were poor, but they knew and remember that they were hungry and constantly cold. These are very concrete things that a child remembers. Nevertheless, the emperor used to say, "We are undeservedly well, and we are grateful for the generosity of the people here on the island." Empress Zita also, throughout her life, told everyone in the family never to be bitter about the situation. God has a plan, and this plan is perfect. The church decided to establish Karl's feast day on October 21st. This is not a coincidence. It's not his death day. It's not his birthday. It's his wedding day. And John Paul II clearly wanted to spread the message to the world that Karl and Zita had an important message to deliver about how to live a fruitful and virtuous marriage. Karl told his wife right after the wedding this striking and moving phrase. He said, "Now we need to help each other to get to heaven." He understood that marriage was not a finality, but a tool, a real vocation to get to a greater cause, which is to go to heaven and be united to God. So Karl and Zita are a great intercessor for all married couples, but also for those who are discerning to get married. And this was my case. I was personally very anxious never to find my wife, never to find the right one. And I made this commitment to pray every day for my vocation, and more particularly for my future wife. I also remember doing a pilgrimage to Lourdes in France with one of my brother, and praying intensively in front of the grotto, in front of the Virgin Mary, saying, "I really need a wife soon." That was in September 2010. 1 month later, I went to the United States, and it is in Washington, D.C. that I met Kathleen, my wife, at the Mass in honor of Blessed Karl. Some people came to me and said, "Do you know that there's a Mass in honor of your great-grandfather?" And I could not believe that there was a devotion to him so far away from home. So of course I went to the Mass, and after the Mass I had the chance to meet with many parishioners, and it is there that after meeting many people but a little bit older, I finally met a group of younger people, among others my future wife. And then I discovered that she had a deep devotion to Empress Zita. She really gave her, or entrusted her, her vocation. So all this, we started to open our eyes and to see all these little signs afterwards. But of course for us, it was a great proof that my great-grandparents remained very active from above. Then a second dimension is Karl as a head of state, as a person of responsibility. You may have heard the quote from this American theologian, James Freeman Clark, who said, "The difference between a politician and a statesman is that a politician thinks about the next election, the statesman thinks about the next generation." Blessed Karl was a true statesman, and he understood that his position was essentially a position of service, regardless if he does serve his own interest or not. We need statesmen, people of service who have a long-term view, not just a couple of years until the next election, but really think about the next election. Thank God we do have good politicians today, true leaders, but we need more Christians engaged in the public sphere. Aristotle, followed later by many Christian scholars, said, "Politics serves as a place where the virtuous life is attained in the best manner." In other words, if you want to be a good statesman, a genuine leader, you need to practice virtue. And we have the example of the 3 theological virtues. We have all the sources about the 4 cardinal virtues. So this is a whole program that we can start now. We are all called to be leaders in our own ways, in our own domains. There's another quote that I like a lot from Habecker, who is the president of the newspaper Christianity Today. And he says, "The true leader serves. He serves people. He serves their best interest. And in doing so, will not always be popular. But because true leaders are motivated by loving concern rather than a desire for personal glory, they are willing to pay the price." So this is what Blessed Karl did, and he was ready to lose his crown and even his life, and he did. During the war, he never gave up hope. He kept on doing everything he could to serve the common good and the welfare of his people. Between November 1916 and November 1918, he realized 82 trips throughout the empire, from Istanbul to Vienna, throughout the whole empire. 82 trips, 80,000 kilometers by train. He forbid systematic bombings of city. The use of gas that he banished. He ordered not to condemn to death prisoners whenever possible. He refused the bombing of Venice. Karl was also the first world leader to establish the Ministry of Social Welfare, which was commissioned to deal with youth, widows, orphans, social insurances, unemployment, and so on. So this was quite unusual at the time. Karl had also a merciful heart, and we can see him with different people. He had a great heart, always listening to people talking to him, no matter what position they had. The third dimension is Karl as emperor and king, but also Karl as a man of God. And Karl considered his position as a commission from God. It did not mean the power to unlimited power, but much more the absolute duty to follow and imitate the example of Jesus Christ. And the coronation in Hungary is a wonderful example. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the coronation, but on YouTube you can find many, also movies. But as Karl was made king, he was anointed by the bishop with sacred oil, and Karl considered this as a new sacrament. Karl one day said to Zita very privately, "I strived always and in all things to understand as clearly as possible the will of God and to follow it. Later, in Madeira, as he was praying in front of the Blessed Sacrament, he felt that God was asking of him the ultimate sacrifice of his life. He did not say yes straight away. He talked about it to his wife, and together they said yes. Zita was pregnant with her 8th child at the time. He became sick shortly after, and got very strong pneumonia. No doctor was granted to come from the continent, so some local doctors had to take care of him. And my great-grandmother always told that he never lost sight of the cross during this time. And the day before he died, Karl said, "I have to suffer so much so that one day all my peoples can come back together." Of course, nobody knows exactly what he meant by this or what inspiration he received, but what is sure is that he offered his life for all his peoples, for peace among all the nations of the empire and Europe, we can say, and Slovakia, of course, as well. After expressing his profound wish to go home, he said to Zita, "I love you so much," and then prayed for all his children, including the unborn one. He then died, pronouncing several times the name of Jesus. At the time, Zita was only 29 years old. She gave birth to their daughter, Elisabeth, soon after Karl's death. She and the children took refuge first in Spain and then in Belgium, a country that offered them for the first time official papers. There, the children could have a normal education. You can see that there were 8, well put in order. And the second picture is in Lequeitio in Spain, where she spent a couple of months there in the Basque countries. Zita as well was a very pious person, and since the death of her husband, she never stopped wearing black as a sign of devotion to him and to his suffering. After more than 60 years in exile, she was finally granted by the Austrian state to come back to Austria in 1982. She died in 1989 at the age of 96 years old in Switzerland. I was still able to meet her. It was a great honor, of course. The problem is that I was very young and I was only 4 years old. So I don't remember the time when I met her, but I do remember my father telling us, "This is a very important moment." So again, from a human perspective, when we assess their lives, it seems that a lot of things went terribly wrong. But the Church wants to show us that whether a life before God succeeds or not does not depend on earthly success. And this was in 2004 during the beatification. So, why did the Church choose him as an example? What is really the legacy of Blessed Karl? And I will end this speech with 3 different thoughts. The first one is that he was strongly rooted in his faith and tradition. There is a desire, especially coming from the West, to redefine our identity as peoples, as nations. Europe, as I said before, is experiencing an identity crisis. Jürgen Habermas even talks about a civilizational crisis. But my great-uncle, Archduke Otto, used to say, if we ignore, or worse, if we reject where we come from, then how can we know where we're going, as we don't know where we are or who we are? We need to understand where we come from in order to be able to look at the future. We need to dive deep down in our roots and in our traditions, because, as Chesterton said, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of a fire that you want to transmit. Europe is an old reality that hasn't started on May 9th, 1950. We cannot define our European identity only based on civic values, on freedom, on rule of law, on democracy. It's not enough to create a deep sense of belonging. You also need historical, cultural, and political, and especially spiritual values. And Slovakia has a lot to contribute on this. Blessed Karl had a deep love for each and every of his peoples. My uncle Archeduke Otto also used to say that Europe is defined also by all these little villages, in the middle of which there is a church. This is Europe, he said. And it's true that all these little churches that we also see here in Slovakia tell something about the importance of Christianity in Europe. The second legacy is about governance of a multicultural entity, such as the Habsburg Empire, but also such as the European Union today. And I think the topic of decentralization of power and culture is fundamental today. It is a very justified and natural wish for nations to desire more autonomy and sovereignty. But this is not in contradiction with being part of a bigger entity, as long as a basic principle is applied, the principle of subsidiarity that I told you about before. This principle of governance enables to allocate competencies and sovereignty starting from the bottom, at the family level, at the local level, leaving at the highest level, that means at the empire at the time or the EU today, only a small amount of competencies that could not be delegated to the lower level. Just to give you an example, at the Vienna level, there was only 4 competencies. All the rest was delegated. Today, this principle is misapplied in many ways at the European level. And this is probably one of the major causes of nationalistic tendencies throughout Europe. Blessed Karl had an interesting plan about a Danubian federation encompassing all the peoples of the empire, delegating most of the competencies and sovereignty, and actually allocating only the 4 major competencies at the supranational level. This was quite revolutionary at the time, but during the war, it was not possible to reform the empire, and at the end of the war, it was too late. And then the third legacy that, in my eyes, is very important, and probably the most important one, is that Blessed Karl was also a sign of contradiction during his life. That means that many of his decisions were not always understood. They were understood later, in his life or after his death. Jesus told us that if the world hates you, know that it hated me before you. And later he said, if they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. Blessed Karl understood the value and the meaning of suffering. He understood that suffering has always a meaning. He was faithful to God and kept his faith in good times, in wealth, in power, but also in difficult times during his time in exile and poverty and illness. Us too, we are called to be signs of contradiction, to stand up for the truth, no matter the price. Our society urges us, pushes us to think and act in a certain way, but we need to follow our interior voice who tells us in prayer what the truth is. This is what Blessed Karl did, and he was ready to lose his crown and even his life. When such times come in the future, Christians are asked to comply with the world and stand up for the truth. But Christians will need to be equipped and be able to rely on a very strong network of friends, and even I can say brothers and sisters in Christ, to find the material, moral, and spiritual support. Christians have a treasure, which is their faith and the truth they hold about the human person. Let us not be shy and share this treasure with all the people surrounding us at every level of society. It is a time that demands courage and sometimes heroism to stand for the truth. The future, of course, is unknown, but we know that in the end, the truth will prevail. May Blessed Karl intercede in a very special way for Slovakia today, so that this nation receives the grace necessary to remain always faithful to its faith and its rich tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Imre, for your talk about the life and the legacy of your great-grandfather Emperor, Blessed Emperor Karl. I'm thinking it's hard to choose a question to start with, but I think I will start with this one. So the main topic of this year's Hanus Days is the fragility of identity. And I think this is something that especially many young people struggle with this day. Some people say that this is a very anxious age that we are living through these days. And many people, especially who are Christians, are struggling to make, to make their Christian identity and make the fact that they are a follower of Jesus quite clear and quite public. It's a situation that many of us young people find in work, in school, in different contexts. So I want to ask you if you can provide maybe some specific examples of maybe how the life of Blessed Emperor Karl as a young man, as a young Christian, how did his spiritual life work? How did he deal with some of the prejudices that he was meeting? Many people considered him a religious fanatic during his time. So can you share some specific examples about his spiritual life and his life as a young Christian?
Yes, absolutely. So it's part of the third dimension that I tried to explain to you. But really, I think he tried to put God in the middle of his life, and to put God in the middle of all his decisions. As you could see throughout his life, he had sometimes to take very difficult decisions. And in order to discern, in order to take the right decision, it's important to do it with God. And otherwise, you rely too much on your own strength. And we had a wonderful speech this morning by Father Pine, and who told us again the importance of prayer and not to rely on our own forces. And I think this is really what he did. And of course, in very difficult times where it was very tempting to use the power he had, but I really think he used it with a lot of discernment.
Thank you. I was thinking, there's one story I think about him when he was becoming the member of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Can you say a bit maybe about that, how he seriously was discerning the responsibilities that are striving from that?
Yes, thank you for asking this, because it shows again this discernment he was making. You know, the Golden Fleece is probably one of the major decoration order in Europe, and as a young archduke, he received it, or at least he was proposed to receive it. And most of the people, if not all, accepted straight away when they received such an order. He took the time to discern. He read the statutes of the Golden Fleece. And at some point he hesitated because it was very, very difficult to comply with all the rules that were asked of a knight of the Golden Fleece. So finally he accepted, of course, and probably it's something that meant a lot to him throughout his life. But again, it shows that he did not take such a decision lightly.
Thank you. My second question is related to something that you mentioned towards the end of the talk, and I think it relates to one of the questions that is in Slido, considering the fact that one of the Slido questions asks whether you might think some sort of monarchy or some sort of constitutional monarchy would be a good option for some countries in Central Europe. I'm not sure if you and your family have any special plans that you are able to share.
I'm not sure I'm allowed to comment on that, but
but what I mean more generally is that, and you mentioned this towards the end of the talk, you mentioned something which is quite countercultural. You said that rule of law is important, democracy is important, being anti-corruption is very important, and these are important values, but these are values, let's call it, from the democratic paradigm that we are living in, certainly in this Central European context from the year 1918. And you very often hear politicians stressing how important this is. And you say we need that, but we also need deeper roots. We need Christian roots, we need roots in tradition. Well, I want to push you a bit harder. How are we to overcome this kind of over-reliance and stress on democracy? I mean, it really does define our age and our generation.
Yes, no, absolutely, you're right. And I think it's important to not put a contradiction between civic values and cultural values, historical values, spiritual values. We need both. We need the rule of law. We need freedom of expression. We even need democracy, absolutely. I think democracy is a very important element in the regime. It's one element among others. Also, democracy was not invented in 1918. And so I think we cannot base our identity on the start of a republic. In the case of Slovakia, you have a much richer and longer history than just, so to say, the 104 last years. You have a very long history that you can be proud of course, with good times, a lot of sufferings as well, like every country has. But again, democracy is one important element. But what does democracy mean? It means to be somehow represented at the parliament in a legislative process. And if we look a little bit at the numbers today, it seems that there's a certain distrust towards public institutions. And so I think democracy is going through a crisis as well. And I think it's important that we fight for democracy in the noble sense of the term. Robert Schuman said, democracy needs to be impregnated with Christianity, otherwise it will fail. And I think that's, of course, another topic, but I think it's a very interesting topic.
You mentioned towards the end of your lecture that Karl was beatified only in the year 2004. I'm a bit curious. That's, how many is it? About 80 years, 80 to 90 years before, after his death. Why did it take so long? And a question relating to that is, do you see that the cult of Blessed Karl as a blessed in the Catholic Church is stronger in some parts of Europe and less so elsewhere? Do you see that as a veneration within the Catholic Church, it's growing, or you've traveled Europe quite a lot talking about him, so maybe you are the person to tell on.
Yes, so he was beatified in 2004, and of course he was not John Paul II, so he was not Santo Subito, and beatified after a couple of years after his death. It took time. I think it's also because of his position as emperor and king. His many efforts to promote peace and to make peace proposals that were very secret at the time, very touchy for a head of state. And so the church is prudent. the Church always remains very prudent, and I think it's very wise. And so it takes the time it needs. Now everything is ready for the next step, for the canonization. The whole document is at the Vatican. The miracles were checked and documented. There were several of them. And now we have to wait on the Pope's desire to canonize him. But what I know, and we had the great pleasure to meet the Pope a couple of years ago and to present to him Blessed Karl and his life. And of course he knew it from before, but he's very touched especially by this dimension of a peacemaker. And I think it's very timely for today, so who knows, maybe it will be soon.
And what's the stage of at what part of the stage of the process of beatification is the cause of Empress Zita? Are we still waiting for a miracle? Should we be praying harder in Slovakia?
You should be praying harder.
Okay, that's
no. It's coming along. Absolutely, it's coming along. Of course, she had a very long life, so it's even more work. She lived 96 years, and it's also well documented. There's the large document is also at the Vatican. Many people working on it. But the most important now, as you mentioned it very rightfully so, is prayer and devotion. Only through prayer and asking her intercession will there be, will we be able to advance the cause.
Okay, this is a call out to Slovakia to pray harder for specific miracles as well. I will ask one question that is very popular among our Slido audience, and I encourage all of you to contribute with your questions and your likes on Slido. A person called Iveta, a lady, is asking whether you could tell us a bit more about the relationship between Blessed Karl and his wife Zita.
Yes, they had a beautiful relationship, very respectful of each other. I told you a little bit about their marriage, how they saw it, really to give each other, and really to spend time also together. Of course, the years where they were married were not easy time, and he had to travel a lot, and she had a deep sense of responsibility. That means that very often she said, I have to accompany my husband on this trip and this trip and this trip. So she was discerning when she had to stay home with the children and when it was her responsibility to accompany Karl. One example of this is when she chose to accompany him for the second restoration attempt in Hungary. She was pregnant. Everybody in Switzerland, where they were in exile, everybody said that she should not go. And she insisted. She said, this is my duty right now to be at the side of my husband. And so on the pictures that you see where she was kneeling at the second attempt, she was pregnant. And from there, they were sent straight away on the boat on the Danube. It went through the whole empire and then through the Mediterranean to Madeira, to the islands. So that means she was pregnant, but she was without the children. The children only were sent to the island a couple of months later. So that was another great suffering they had, is to be separated from their children for so long. And maybe a last element about their relationship that always struck me is that the way they discussed about every decision. She was discreet, but she was very quick in mind, very smart, and had opinion on many things. And so she was very often present during important matters, important discussions. And they discussed about everything, but at the end, she always respected his decision, because she knew that he was the head of state and he had to take the final decision. But they really had this amazing relationship where they were able to share a lot of elements together.
Thank you. Next question from Slido is asking about the relationship between church and state and your views on it, but I will take the leisure of expanding the question a little bit more. I think what's interesting about Emperor Karl is that he was the head of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire really was a sort of secular pillar of the Catholic Church in Europe all throughout early modernity. When other countries were going Republican, when other countries were going Protestant, throughout all this time, if there was one country that the popes more or less could rely on, it would be Austrian Empire or later Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was the case with Franz Joseph, this was the case with Blessed Karl. So my question is, in what ways can Blessed Emperor Karl, as the head of a state, in his dealing with the bishops, with priests, with the Pope at the time, be an example of what the relationship of the church and state might look like?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Not an easy one, because it's important to make really the distinction between both powers, the spiritual one and the temporal one. And for a while throughout history, sometimes they were mixed of both. But I think it's sane to say that these two powers should be separate, but nourishing each other. And as you mentioned, this was really the case if you look at all the letters that were sent between the Pope Benedict XV at the time and Emperor Karl. They had an amazing relationship. He was representing the spiritual power, and Karl was representing the temporal power here in the empire. Of course, there's a certain hierarchy when it comes to the authority, and as a Christian emperor and king, for him the higher authority was always to follow the will of God, and in this way the church was representing it. So to talk a little bit about today's society, I'm not so familiar about the situation here, but it's true that more and more we tend to put aside this spiritual dimension in our society. And I think it's important that Christians are open about their faith, do not keep it only for the private sphere, but can really communicate it. It's a treasure we have, and we need to communicate it. So absolutely, I think it's the duty for every Christian to be representative of our Christian values and the Christian faith in our society.
Thank you. I had one other question on mind. What was it? I'll take one from Slido. Well, this is a personal question, if I may dare ask it, but you brought up the topic yourself to start with. Somebody's asking, can you tell us a bit more about your marriage with Kathleen? What are your tips how to have a successful marriage, a good marriage, as a young Catholic man?
That becomes very private.
You brought it up, as I said.
No, I would say it would be wonderful if we can follow the example of Karl and Zita. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. But I told you a little bit how we met and how I can really see the red line. You know, the how to say this. The will of God and the intercession, the power of intercession of heaven in our lives, and we can only be grateful for that. Of course, we try as a couple to educate our children in a Christian way, according to the Catholic faith. It's very important, especially nowadays. As you know, also in the education sphere, it's getting more and more difficult to discern what education a child will receive from a public school, for example. And so the importance, the responsibility of the parents is very important. And so we discussed this. I'm very lucky to have a wife that is very engaged in all these topics, very knowledgeable. Sometimes I see her a little bit like Zita, who has opinion about many things, but who also is very wise and has a very deep sensibility. So she's definitely somebody with whom I share a lot, if not everything.
Okay, So the advice to young Catholic men is find a pious Catholic American.
If you happen to go there.
Just joking. We are free to take some questions from the audience as well. So if anybody would like to raise and ask a question in Slovak or in English, gentlemen in the first row.
Thank you. Sorry. Do you have your own opinion why this nice monarchy did not survive the First War? My personal opinion is that only two nations, the German and the Hungarian, had their full rights. The Slavic nations, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, not even Romans, Romania, had their same rights. And this was a problem after this treaty 1867, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. But inside Hungary, the Slovaks were not quite equal to Hungarian. And the same was the problem with other smaller nations in this very nice country, which was condemned to burst because of not quite, the Slavic nations were not satisfied in it. I'm sorry to tell it this way, but probably this was the reason.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think there's different reasons, and I think you also mentioned probably the main reason. But I will start with another one, and then going back to your point. The other reason is that many people at the time considered Austro-Hungary, or this empire, as being a little bit the last Christian empire in Europe, and represented by a family that was openly Catholic. And probably after the French Revolution, the next big target was Austria-Hungary later. And so I think there was definitely plans to change this and to install throughout Europe another way of governance. And so the second reason is what you mentioned, and I think it's absolutely true, is that after the Austrian Empire, there was the Ausgleich with 1867 in a very dualist system. This dualist system only lasted 50 years. 50 years. It was not perfect, but it was the solution that Emperor Franz Joseph found at the time. What is important, I think, to look at is the reform plan of Franz Ferdinand and his advisor Popovici, and later Blessed Karl himself. They were very close, Franz Ferdinand and Blessed Karl. They talked a lot together. And Franz Ferdinand showed him actually his plan, and it convinced Blessed Karl of this plan of decentralizing massively the empire. The first step was done with the Ausgleich. Another step was to give a third crown to the Slavs, the Wenceslas crown, especially to Bohemia at the time, and then the Slavs of the south. That was the plan of Franz Ferdinand. And Blessed Karl, and there's a book who just came out about it, because the letter were now published, had a plan to go even further, is to decentralize and to give actually every peoples, whenever possible, more sovereignty and independence. But he also said that he envisioned this confederation or this federation within an empire. And he talks about it in the letters to the Pope, and he says, I think it can only be within an empire, because otherwise the Christian's principles will be falling very quickly. But we need to reform, and we need to give the peoples of the empire are now ready. The time has come to decentralize always more. Of course, it's always easy to say that 100 years later. I think at the time, the situation was, of course, very complex. Every country, every nationality, every people had their own interest. If you look at Hungary, if you look at Austria, If you look at Slovakia, Bohemia and so on, Croatia, I mean, all these different peoples had their interest. And our family was never in place to impose things from the top. Otherwise, it would be contradicting what I just said. We tried to build up things from the bottom to the top. That means that there's a time for everything. Of course, during the war, it was not possible to do the reforms, and the empire collapsed very quickly. But I really urge you to, now that it's public, I really urge you to read about his plan of the Danubian Confederation, which is actually a federation. And there are very interesting elements that I discovered actually the last year. And the EU has also its challenges. You know, Slovakia is within the EU. An interesting question is to ask how many competencies the EU has compared to Vienna at the time. And so, again, we come back to this question of subsidiarity and of delegation of sovereignty.
We have more space for questions from the audience. Let me see if we have many hands raised, and let me choose. Who shall we have ask a question? Shall we have? Let's ask Juraj Šust further at the back. Juraj is the head of this festival. Let's see what he has to ask.
Thank you. Let me ask a question. Do you think that cooperation of Central European countries, inspired by the Catholic legacy of Blessed Carol, could be good alternative to current European Union? Thanks.
It's hard to answer. I mean, what is sure is that there's a natural spirit of collaboration among many peoples with a big P, peoples here in Central Europe. We see it also with Visegrad 4, but I know that one of my uncles talked also about Visegrad 5, you know, encompassing also Austria, and we can encompass many other countries that share a little bit the same spirit. But I think this needs to be really well thought, and what is sure, again, to the former topic, is that the desire for more sovereignty, for more autonomy, is a very justified desire of every nation. But again, it's not in contradiction with being part of a bigger entity, whether it's the EU today or something else. But it needs to be very well constructed within this principle of subsidiarity. And subsidiarity, by the way, is very related to another principle of the social doctrine of the Church, which is solidarity among the different countries. And so the compendium of the Catholic Church is a very, very rich source for anybody who wants to research and to go deeper into principles of governance.
Shall we have more questions from the audience? The lady in the first row.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for your excellent lecture. Well, I would like to ask, as historian, and I would also like to bring Slovak aspect into the discussion, the Slovak history. I would like to stress that the relations between Habsburgs and the Slovaks did not stop 1918 after the collapse of monarchy, but they continued. And they continued, first of all, in Slovak exile, so let's say after the Second World War. And first of all, on the bottom of the Slovak World Congress, which you may never heard about, Slovak World Congress was established in 1970 when Slovakia didn't have its own state, it didn't have its own diplomacy, and it was suffering behind the Iron Curtain under the communist rule. Why I'm mentioning it is because in the Slovak World Congress there was a very good cooperation between the leadership, which was first of all Stefan Roman or Stephen Roman, Canadian Slovak industrialist, a very rich man, and first of all, Otto Habsburg, you have mentioned, and Robert Habsburg. So they were very good relations. They came many times to the so-called General Assemblies of the Slovak World Congress, and so on and so on. And to mention also, there was a good cooperation also on the European Parliament in Strasbourg, where Otto Habsburg invited the delegation of the Slovak World Congress in 1974. So maybe, have you heard something about these relations?
Yes, thank you very much for mentioning this. It's a wonderful story that you just told, and thank you for that. Absolutely, I know that my grand uncle Otto was very involved and concerned about, first of all, this period before the fall of the Iron Curtain, when all these countries were in the communist empire, so to say, and because they did not have any voice at the European level. And at the time, what we call the European level was Western Europe, which is just half of what Europe really is. And so I remember also a time where he was at the European Parliament, and he started talking also in other languages that were not part of the EU at the time, to show that all these countries have their place in Europe as well. But it reminds me also another story, a little bit shorter to or right after the fall of the Iron Curtain. There was a gathering at the Karl Marx University in Hungary. It was called Karl Marx still. And my father was working very closely with his uncle, Archduke Otto. And he told me the story again a couple of days ago on the phone, because I asked him to be, so that I'm sure that it remains fresh in my mind. And he said that he remembers being in this big room with many tables and delegation from many different countries of Central Europe. And his uncle, Otto, came to him and said, "Look here on this table, here are the Slovaks. Go to them and build a relationship and see what you can do for them and how you can, help them." And so my father went, he was quite young, and started talking with the people. And since then, he came several times here in Slovakia at a moment where it was a bit difficult still, and met with many people within Slovakia. He learned the language. Before that, his uncle Otto asked him to learn Hungarian, and then he said, "Well, actually stop, now learn Slovak." So he had to stop Hungarian and learn Slovakian. And he still speaks a bit of Slovakian. Unfortunately, he had less opportunity to practice it. But he always tells me about this great love that he has for this country, and all the travels he made, from north to south, east to west. And so yes, I confirm that this relationship did not stop in 1918, and that this love that I told you about from Blessed Karl really continued throughout the family.
Maybe this deserves an applause. I can testify to the fact that your father's Slovak is still pretty good. When I recently had a chance to meet him, his first words were "Ako sa máte?" And he had a lot of stories to share about his time coming to Slovakia at the turn of 1980s and 1990s. But maybe this is a good way to jump to the one other topic which we haven't touched upon yet, which you didn't mention in the talk either, but I think would be good to bring up in our discussion. And that's the topic of the European Fraternity, the network of young Christian professionals that you have helped to found and have been involved with for the last few years, and you are now a president of. I recently had a chance to meet your father at the annual meeting of the fraternity in Krakow, and we had a great time. But I'm thinking maybe you can give us a short elevator pitch on the European Fraternity and how it relates to the legacy of Blessed Emperor Karl, perhaps.
Yes, the European Fraternity started in 2016, and basically it was started on a simple observation, is that there are many Christians engaged throughout Europe but too often they are isolated in their work, isolated in their faith, not being able to share their faith, their crosses, their successes as well. And we wanted to create a place, a space where Christians could meet in a climate of trust and share their faith and share what they have on their heart. So the European Fraternity is now a network of Christians coming from 28 different European countries, and it is based on spiritual resourcing and spiritual support. That means members pray for each other and support each other spiritually. The second pillar is cultural awareness about Europe. What Europe really means. What is the soul of Europe? You know that Robert Schuman, who is one of the founders of the European communities, said that we cannot stop at an economic collaboration among the countries. We need to rediscover the soul of Europe. And I think this is still a process that is going on, and the European Fraternity, among others, want to contribute to this and discover this very rich heritage of Europe in order to better see where we're going in the future. The third pillar is the collaboration among the Christians. We are people from different backgrounds, different competencies, skills, and we can do amazing things if we work together. So that's the three pillars. But I would say that the spirit that nourishes the European Fraternity is to learn how to become again, or how to understand ourselves as creative minorities. And maybe I will tell you a little story, if I may, from Pope Benedict the 16th, who traveled to Czech Republic. And he was in his plane to Czech Republic, and the journalist came to him and said, "Your Holiness, why are you going to the most atheist country in Europe? Between 70 and 80% of people write down that they do not believe in God. So it's the highest in Europe." And his answer was, as long as Christians are there, they need to understand themselves as creative minorities capable of changing the course of history. And when I read this, I said, this is for the European Fraternity. We need to be those Christians who are certainly, yes, in minorities, not on paper. On paper, we are a big majority, but committed Christians getting more and more in minority. But we need to be creative, and we need to be always hopeful about the future. And together, we can do amazing things if we are very, creative and well-equipped. And that's why it's a special pleasure to have several members here present, and it's also a great support and encouragement.
Yes, if anybody was interested to hear more about the European Fraternity, there's many members here with us this evening, so feel free to approach any of us, Imre, myself, or others. I'm thinking, do we have more questions from the audience? Anybody wants to ask a question? We have a young gentleman in the last row on the right. Samuel. Okay, Samuel, then I'm here. Okay, Gloria, please.
It's for the previous topic. My question is about Otto Habsburg, because as I know, he offered a lot of money to Hungary. So could you tell me if I'm right, and if yes, why did he exactly do that, on which special occasion, for what reason?
That he offered money, you said?
Yes.
I did not know he had money.
Really?
You know, the family lost everything several times in the last century. The first time, of course, at the end of the First World War. And then again with the Anschluss of Hitler, who confiscated everything. And up to this day, many things are confiscated by the state. And so I'm not sure, I'm not aware at least of this information. What is probably the case is that he received maybe legs, or donations, and he reoriented them to people who needed it, and it might be some organizations also in Hungary, but I'm not aware of this. But one thing that makes me think of that, and it's maybe a story worth telling, is that as they had nothing, really, I mean, you heard the story, and they really did not have any money to live. Empress Zita educated very strongly all their children, all her children. And she said that they all need to work very hard. And so they all did wonderful careers and were quite successful, but they decided that the role of the head of the family, which was Uncle Otto, was to speak for the different countries of the empire. And this is an unremunerated job. So what they did, there were 5 brothers. What they did is that 4 worked very hard and then reversed a percentage of their salary every month to their brother, their older brother Otto. And that enabled him to have his family as well and to continue writing books and traveling all over Europe. So this is a little bit, this tells you also about the solidarity within the family.
Thank you.
We have one more question in the last row at the back, if we can get the microphone there.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the great talk. I have only one question. Can you give us any practical advice how to raise our children in a great intellectual, that have great intellectual values, civic values, and most importantly, the Catholic values in these modern times?
Absolutely. I think first, a lot of love, good books, and send them out in the nature. I think it's so important. I think we don't have to think too far about how to educate a child. It needs to be something very natural for parents. And so, of course, to give a lot of love to the children, to be as present as possible. When I say good books is, of course, a great formation. And we heard this last few days and all the richness, intellectual richness that we have. And so education is so important, especially in a time where ideology, pushes through, even in schools, especially in public schools. So there's definitely something to protect the children and to be sure that the parents keep, in a way, the leadership in the education of the children. And then the third one is just to learn about the nature. A child should be out as much as possible. And from our own experience, it's beautiful to see our 4 daughters growing. And I have to say, it's really thanks to my wife, who has a very deep sense of education, and I'm just following. And of course, approving 100% of all her intuition, because this is the next generation we are building up. So as parents, we have a great responsibility.
I want to now ask one question from Slido as well. It's very brief. Who would actually now be the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne? Who is the head of the family right now, actually?
He's called Karl. We are very original in the family. So he's another Karl, who is about 60 years old now, and he's the son of Archduke Otto.
Okay. And if I can ask, how large is actually the family now? Like, how many Habsburgs is there now in Europe?
Well, we are quite numerous, because the emperor had 8 children, and 7 of the 8 children had children. So we are quite numerous. I couldn't tell you how many. And then there are 4, or there used to be 4 branches in the family. So you have the branch that comes from the emperor. You have the Hungarian branch that is still quite numerous today. You had the Polish branch, which died out a couple of years ago. I met with my wife the last Polish Habsburg in Zawiecz, and who was an amazing woman. And the fourth one is the Toscana. Scan branch. So we are quite numerous.
Okay, that's quite spread across Europe, as it used to be in the old days. I will perhaps ask one final question. Maybe there will be a little bit of follow-up on it, but so your great-grandfather was not only an emperor, but he's also venerated as a blessed in the Catholic Church. Archduke Imre, do you ever feel under pressure?
Well, you know, sanctity is not hereditary, so we need to work a lot for that. No, really, honestly, I don't feel under pressure because I didn't do anything to have the name I have. I was born in this family. At the time we had rights and duties. Today we have only duties. And this duty, I think, is quite simple, is to transmit what we can and the best we can, the legacy of our family, and especially the legacy of Blessed Karl. It's probably not a coincidence that God chose him to be the last emperor and king. As I said during my speech, in the eyes of the world, he seems to be a total failure. Everything he did failed. But again, from another perspective, from the perspective of the church, or even more important, from the heavenly perspective, it is somebody who followed the will of God. And we can see today, people are speaking much more about Blessed Karl than Franz Josef. And Blessed Karl ruled 2 years, and Franz Josef 68. And so again, God has a plan, but he also has his time. And it's not our time, and so we cannot control, his plan. We just know that it's a good plan and that it's better to trust it.
What better way to finish a discussion of the life and legacy of Blessed Emperor and King Karl von Habsburg-Lothringen. I would like to take the opportunity to thank you, Imre, for coming to Bratislava, for sharing the thoughts about your family history and the history of Central Europe, and also our Slovak history. It was a great pleasure to have you here with us in Bratislava. A big applause, please.
Ďakujeme aj moderátorovi dnešného večera, Samuelovi. Prosím, potlesk aj pre ňoho. Ďakujem aj našim partnerom a podporovateľom. Hlavnými partnermi sú advokátska kancelária Lisina Roško & Partners, spoločnosť Plaut a Fond na podporu umenia, ktorý podporil festival z verejných zdrojov. Hlavní mediálni partneri, konzervatívny denník Postoj, portál Nové mesto a denník Štandard. Po prestávke bude nasledovať diskusia o tom, či je svetosť nedosiahnuteľným ideálom. Diskutovať budú Magdalena Gerová, pán arcivojvoda Imre von Habsburg-Lothringen a Gregory Marie Páň, Dominikán. Iba vás chcem upozorniť, že tí, čo ostávate a potrebujete preklad, lebo to bude tiež v angličtine, tak si nechajte slúchadka pri sebe a vráťte až po skončení celého dnešného podujatia. Zajtra vás pozývame na hudobný dialog a talk show s názvom Lež and Grey, Jana a Lukáš Zubajovci, dialog dvoch svetov o 17:30 a na moderovanú diskusiu o tom, prečo sa pápež pletie do ekonomiky o 20. hodine. Chcem vás upozorniť na umelecké dielo po mojej ľavici, ktoré doplňa tému dnešného festivála Krehkosť identít. Je to sklenený obraz s názvom Ex tabula rasa od renomovaného slovenského výtvarníka Pala Macha. Zároveň by som vás chcel pozvať k jednej veci. Ak sa vám páči tento festival, vidíte zmysel v tom, čo robíme, môžete nás podporiť aj finančne. Môžete tak urobiť prostredníctvom stránky slh.sk alebo na tých BHD novinách, ktoré ste mali na sedačke, je taký QR kód na poslednej strane. No a zároveň by som rád predstavil ešte jedného nádejného fyzika. Matej, kde si? Poď. Matej sa rozhodol, že ide študovať na Cambridge filozofiu vedy. Matej, povedz nám prečo a ako ti môžeme pomôcť.
Najprv chcem poďakovať Dimovi a Jurajovi Šustovi za privítanie. A chcel by som ja tak v krátkosti povedať, že vnímam, že v prostredí, ktoré má blízko práve ku BHD, spoločenstvu Ladislava Hanusa alebo kolegiu Antona Neuwirta, ale ľudí, ktorí aktívnym spôsobom prepájajú práve vedu a filozofiu, ktorí majú vzdelanie aj prírodovedné, aj humanitné. A dostal som práve možnosť na Cambridge študovať filozofiu vedy a verím, že to môžem robiť práve s backgroundom z fyziky, z matfizu a filozofie z kolegia Antona Neuwirta. No a avšak na to, aby som sa tam mohol dostať a pokryť náklady na štúdium, som zriadil takú veľkú fundraisingovú kampaň, kde už vyše 140 ľudí je súčasťou. A ak sa vám to páči a vidíte zmysel, tak sa tiež môžete stať jej súčasťou a podporiť to a na stránke donio.sk/Matej na Cambridge. A taktiež neváhajte ma zastaviť a spýtať sa aj na to štúdium. Veľmi rád sa s vami o tom porozprávam a zazdielam nejaké myšlienky k tomu. Tak ďakujem pekne.
Bol Matej. Pozývame vás aj do nášho BHD shopu, kde môžete si kúpiť výbornú kávu, výbornú literatúru. Máme tam chválonožky, takéto brandové BHD. Prostredníctvom kúpy týchto ponožiek podporíte aj tento festival, budete mať pamiatku a hlavne tam nájdete nové číslo časopisu Verbum, ktoré od minulého roku vydáva vlastne spoločenstvo Ladislava Hanusa. Je tam veľa výborných esej aj článkov. Ten článok to napísal aj Samuel Trizuljak. Oplatí sa to prečítať. A keď nemáte predchádzajúce dve čísla, aj tie sa oplatí prečítať, lebo tam má tiež esej Samuel Trizuljak. A keď budete odchádzať, nezabudnite tie noviny. Tam nemá esej Samuel Trizuljak, ale aj tak si ich zoberte. A môžete sa ponúknuť aj v našom bufete, kde si môžete dať pivo, kofolu, víno alebo nejaké občerstvenie. Pekný večer.